Not sure if you're taking effective notes when studying? By the end of this video, you'll know how to take effective notes so that you know you're making the most out of your study sessions. For more language-related content, subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon to be notified when I post a new video. After switching the way that I take notes, I've noticed I remember vocabulary and grammar a lot better, and I hope that I can help you do the same. I keep my notes nice and simple. At the top, I have what lesson I'm on and what that lesson's about. I highlight examples so that I can distinguish it from the notes I took about that lesson. And in a different color, I like to highlight any important notes I made. Tip number 1. Don't write down word for word in your notebook what the textbook or website says. Here you can see this is an entire section that explains how the adjective ida works in Korean. There was a lot of text. What I did was condense it down into 2 lines and I wrote an example sentence. If you're just writing down word for word what you're reading, how do you know that you fully understand the grammar? What I like to do is read the entire section on that grammar note and then try to paraphrase it, put it into my own words just to see if I truly understand what I just read. And along with that tip, don't write down the example sentences that the textbook gives you. Try to come up with your own, and that serves 2 purposes. If you're able to write your own example sentences, then you truly know that you understood what you just read. And if you're using your own sentences, you're probably using vocabulary that you learned in previous lessons or from other resources, and that means you're also reviewing old vocabulary while learning new grammar, and that'll just help keep that old vocabulary fresh in your mind. However, if you've just started studying Korean and you have no idea about any other vocabulary, then for now, just stick with writing down the example sentences that are given to you. However, it's still very important that you put the grammar explanation into your own words. Tip number 2. Don't write down the translations of your example sentences, and that's very important. Why? Well, if you're writing down the English translations, when you go back to look at your notes later, how do you know you really remember the grammar and vocabulary if you're just able to easily see the translation of that sentence? So if you really want to test to make sure that you understood that grammar and vocabulary, when you go back to look at your notes, you don't want to see any English translations or any kinds of translations at all. And if you have to look up the vocabulary and grammar again, that's just helping you get that grammar and vocabulary stuck into your head because you're constantly reviewing it versus relying on a translation. That might take you a longer time to actually remember what you're learning if you're relying too heavily on translations of your example sentences. So make sure when you do write down examples, you are not writing down the translations as well. I'm curious, comment down below and tell me how you typically take notes. Tip number 3, think of different scenarios when you're writing down your example sentences. What I mean by that is, if it's possible, don't write just one example sentence for the grammar, but have about 2 or 3 sentences that are all connected that you can use when talking to someone. For example, if you're learning how to form questions, write down that question, but then also write down a few different statements that can go along with that question. That way you're kind of practicing with using that grammar and vocabulary that you just learned in a specific context that you can actually apply to your real life. I think it's a lot better when we're able to have a context for our sentences and vocabulary, because then we're easily able to apply that when we're having a conversation with a real person versus just writing down one example sentence, but you're not really sure when you're going to be able to use it because you have no idea or no context for when you would be able to use it. And tip number 4, review your notes. So I mentioned this earlier, but it's extremely important to review your notes because when you go back without looking at translations, because you didn't write any, you'll be able to see how much you actually remember. And if you've forgotten a lot, that just means you need to keep going back and reviewing that grammar and vocabulary that you've learned until it sticks in your head, which is why I think it's so important to not use translations, because when you go back, if you have those translations, like I said before, how do you know if you really remember the grammar and vocabulary if you already know what the sentence says because there's an English translation right there? So just make sure you're reviewing your notes every once in a while, because it's really rare that you can write something down and then you never need to look back on it again in order for that concept to be a permanent part of what you know in that language. So make sure you're reviewing your notes before you amass 10 plus chapters of notes that you've never looked over. So to quickly recap, make sure you're paraphrasing and writing your own example sentences if possible. Don't translate your example sentences. Think of scenarios for when you can use that grammar and vocabulary and try to write 2 or 3 connected sentences as example sentences. And 4, review your notes. Now you know how to effectively take notes so that you can remember what you've learned. But if you're a complete beginner and you have no idea where to start learning, then I have a download for 6 free tips to help you get started with learning a second language. If you found this video helpful, and I really hope you did, then hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.